Golda, I was wrong in everything. We are headed towards a catastrophe. We shall have to withdraw on the Jolan Heights to the edge of the escarpment overlooking the valley, and in the south in Sinai to the passes, and hold on to the last bullet. A shaken and pessimistic Moshe Dayan spoke these words of woe to Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir soon after returning from a flying visit to both the Egyptian and Syrian fronts. These words reflect the magnitude of the psychological shock received by the Israelis after the Arabs' surprise attack of 6th October. But the Israeli psychological vulnerability was many times more than their actual military and strategic vulnerability, and cooler heads than Dayan were fully cognizant of that fact. The war of 1973 had begun with a spectacular Arab onslaught, but the Israelis would now launch their own response, and they would be squarely backed by the most powerful country in the world. I am Dr. Hassan Bukhari, and this is the 21st episode of our series, Palestine versus Israel. In this episode, we will discuss the 1973 Arab-Israel War in detail. First, I will discuss the Syrian front in detail, followed by a discussion about the Egyptian front. The Syrians had launched a surprise attack on the Jolan Heights at the same time when the Egyptian canal crossing operation began on the 6th of October. Initially, the Syrians had about 5 times as many men and tanks on the front line, but they knew that this advantage will be sharply eroded in the next 24 to 48 hours as huge Israeli reserves would join the fray. The Syrians had to regain the heights and then dig in to face the inevitable Israeli counterpunch. They hoped to catch the Israelis unaware, smash their border forces, and then force them to commit their reserves piecemeal. Raphael Eitan, the Israeli commander on the Jolan Heights, had 12,000 men and about 200 tanks to blunt the Syrian attack. Initially, the Syrian attack went well, but the Israelis fought back ferociously. The Syrians recaptured Quneitra, the capital of Jolan, but were unable to liberate all of Jolan. They also managed to capture Mount Hermon, which was the highest point in Jolan and had great tactical value. The Israeli High Command gave more priority to the Syrian front, as in contrast to the Sinai, the Jolan was located in close proximity to Israel's heartland. Israeli Strategic Reserve's main force, an armored division led by General Musa Palad, was sent to the Syrian front. This decision left the Jordan-Israel border completely denuded of troops, but Israel had apparently great confidence in King Hussein and his ability to betray the Arabs. By the 9th of October, the Syrian attack had petered out, with Israel still holding on to a significant portion of the Jolan. Trevor Dupai wrote regarding the causes of failure of the Syrian offensive. After the war, there was speculation among foreign observers and even within the IDF as to the reasons for the inability of the Syrians to break through. The Syrian failure has been variously attributed to the self-sacrificing efforts of the Israeli Air Force, to the breakdown of the Syrian logistical system, and to general Syrian ineptness and failure to realize how close they were to victory. The next day, the Israeli counterattack led by Palad's division was launched. By the end of the day, the Israelis had managed to recapture Quneitra and pushed the Syrians back across the 1967 ceasefire line. The Israelis now chose to press on and launched an offensive in the direction of Damascus. The Syrians were forced to retreat, but they fought back tenaciously and managed to inflict significant losses on the Israelis. At this point, Syria's President Hafez al-Assad began issuing frantic appeals for help. Iraq sent a sizable force of 2 divisions. Later, this force was further augmented and ultimately reached a size of 30,000 men and 500 tanks. The arrival of Iraqis helped stall the Israelis, who were forced to halt about 30 miles away from Damascus. By the 14th of October, the Syrian front had stabilized. According to Trevor Depay, the arrival of the Iraqis, the steadiness of the Syrian 3rd Division, the exhaustion of the Israeli troops who had been fighting steadily in defense and offense without let up for a full week, and concern of the Israeli General Staff about exceptionally high consumption of tank and artillery ammunition and the consequent depletion of Israeli stockpiles caused Al-Azhar to order Houthi to stop his offensive on the Syrian front. The Israelis began to dig in. The Israelis didn't go to the offensive in this sector for the rest of the war, except for a commando operation to recapture Mount Hermon on the 22nd of October. The Arabs, whose forces were further swollen by the arrival of 2 Jordanian brigades sent by King Hussein to ensure his token participation in the war, mounted some attacks to push back the Israelis, but these attacks resulted in the recapture of only a small area. By the time of the ceasefire, the Arab forces were preparing for another major offensive, but aborted it to accommodate Egypt's intense desire for an immediate ceasefire. Now, we will turn our attention towards the Egyptian front. At the end of the last episode, I had mentioned that General Shmuel Gonen, the commander of Israel's Southern Command, had ordered General Adan to attack the Egyptians along the canal bank, despite the latter's misgivings about this course of action. The attack failed miserably. After this setback, Israeli Chief of General Staff General Al-Azhar ordered the Southern Command to remain on the defensive and cut its losses for the time being. General Chaim Bar-Lev was also brought in to assume the command of this front, while Gonen was retained as his deputy despite his abysmal performance. On the same day, the Egyptian Chief of General Staff, General Saad al-Shazli, declared in an order of the day to his troops, "The war has retrieved Arab honor. Even if we will be defeated now, no one can say that the Egyptian soldier is not a superior fighter." By the 9th of October, the Egyptians had about 800 tanks and over 90,000 troops east of the canal. About 900 more tanks of the armored and mechanized divisions of the 2nd and 3rd armies remained on the west bank in reserve. The Israelis had attacked twice and failed miserably. Their psychological vulnerability, despite the success on the Syrian front, coupled with a shrewd appreciation of the fact that their psychological vulnerability could be used to guilt the Americans into making unprecedented efforts on their behalf, caused them to make lachrymose and desperate appeals for help. The Machiavellian U.S. National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger first attempted to use this situation to broker a ceasefire in place. The Israelis, due to their success in Jolan, were somewhat willing, but Anwar Sadat refused. In hindsight, Sadat lost an important opportunity. Undeterred, Kissinger declared that a defeat of American arms by Soviet arms wielded by Egypt and Syria would be a geopolitical disaster for America. American assistance was essential for Israel to pull itself together. US President Nixon concurred and declared, "The Israelis must not be allowed to lose." So, the US responded to the Israeli appeals with an unprecedented airlift of war material. Trevor Depay writes, "By October 11, the government of Israel had come to the conclusion that another week of such losses and consumption would so deplete Israeli stocks that Israel would be overrun. Early the next day, a report to this effect was presented to the United States government by the Israeli ambassador Simcha Dinitz in a letter which asserted that the future of the state of Israel is at stake. Accordingly, on October 13, President Nixon made the decision to provide the Israelis with virtually everything they asked for, even if this meant the depletion of US war reserves. According to Howard Sacker, Nixon himself gave the Pentagon specific orders for an emergency American military airlift to Israel. Whatever its earlier hesitation, the Department of Defense this time responded immediately and cooperatively. From military airfields in New Jersey and Delaware, giant C-130 and C-5 cargo planes loaded with tanks, bombs, shells, helicopters, spare transmissions, electronic jamming equipment, and other material began a round-the-clock airlift. Saka further mentions, between October 14 and November 14, the United States transported 22,000 tons of equipment in 566 flights. Much also later came by sea. Ultimately, American shipments were valued at $825 million, exclusive of the cost of transport. On October 19, Nixon asked Congress for $2.2 billion in appropriations to cover this and subsequent military aid for Israel to maintain a balance of forces and thus achieve stability in the Middle East. It must be noted here that the American air supply operation, named Operation Nickel Grass, was the largest airlift in the history of mankind. One might be tempted to think here that the retrieval of Israeli fortunes in war was the result of this unprecedented American help. Egyptian President Sadat later expressed this sentiment multiple times. But one would be wrong to believe that. The Soviets also undertook a massive air supply operation to help their Arab allies. Granted that the Soviet airlift was smaller than the US one, but they did manage to send 15,000 tons of equipment to the Arabs, somewhat diluting the effects of American help to the Israelis. The real reason of the war's turnaround on the Egyptian front was Sadat's folly, who ordered the Egyptians to launch an ill-advised attack on the Israelis beyond the SAM umbrella. Interestingly, many Israeli hotheads like Ariel Sharon were pushing for another major offensive to punch a hole in the Egyptian line and cross over to the western bank of the canal to attack the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies from the rear. The more cautious Israeli Chief of General Staff, David Elazar, wanted to wait for an Egyptian attack beyond the SAM umbrella first. On the 12th of October, the Israeli High Command resolved the argument by deciding that a canal crossing operation would be attempted even if the Egyptians don't come out of the SAM shield. Had the Israelis made such an effort, it was highly likely that it would have failed with huge losses, like the attack by Mendler and Adan from 6th to the 8th of October. But fate was smiling on the Israelis. Ironically, on the same fateful day of 12 October, General Shazli was ordered by Sadat to launch an attack in the direction of Gidi and Mitla passes in order to relieve some pressure from the Syrians. Shazli hesitated, but on the next day he was firmly told by War Minister Ahmed Ismail Ali to launch the attack. It is a political decision. We must develop our attack by tomorrow morning, said Ismail despite his own misgivings. Shazli considered the decision quite bizarre. In his memoirs, he observed, "It was President Sadat's decision. He has claimed that he did it to relieve the Israeli pressure on the Syrian front. But the timing of the attack doesn't fit Sadat's explanation. By October 12, the Syrian front was already stabilizing." On the 14th of October, 1,000 Egyptian tanks were hurled at the Israelis. 800 Israeli tanks and the superb Israeli Air Force were waiting for this opportunity. As feared by Shazli and Ismail, the Israelis hammered the Egyptians. 260 tanks were destroyed and the rest limped back. The Israelis just lost 40 tanks. Sadat's folly gave Israel the opportunity it was desperate for, and it vigorously launched a counter-offensive on the 15th of October. Ariel Sharon's Deviant spearheaded the attack, which was launched at the point of junction of the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies. According to General Shazli, the weak point in our line was the 20 to 25 mile gap, roughly corresponding to the eastern shores of the Bitter Lakes, which remained between the bridgeheads of the 2nd and 3rd armies. Most of the gap was outside the protection of our shore batteries. The Israelis maintained that they had prepared a spot known as the compound to serve as a launching pad for crossing the canal in this region even before the war. The Egyptians, on the other hand, believed that this weak point was found for the Israelis by their American allies. Trevor Dupuy writes, "The Egyptians are convinced that an American satellite or the two high-level reconnaissance planes which they had seen flying over the area on the 13th found the gap for the Israelis. Sharon was expecting a swift crossing, but he got embroiled in the most brutal battle of the war. Near the crossing point was a former Japanese-operated agricultural station commonly known as the Chinese Farm. The Egyptians had made the Chinese Farm a base, and from here they launched vicious attacks to crush Sharon's division. Sharon took heavy losses and failed to lay a bridge across the canal for the crossing. He was then reinforced with General Abraham Adam's division and massive air support. The Battle of the Chinese Farm raged on for 2 days, but the Israelis ultimately prevailed. Howard Sacker writes, by October 17, the murderous struggle for the corridor on the East Bank had begun shifting in Israel's favor. At heavy cost, battling for every yard, Adan's tanks gradually levered the Egyptians away from the roads north of the Great Bitter Lake. The redoubt at the Chinese Farm was slowly being overcome. By 8 o'clock that morning, tanks had fought their way through to the water's edge, towing the bridge's first pontoon. In the next hours, more pontoons arrived. The partially assembled bridge took a heavy shelling, and Israeli engineers laboring in the midst of the bombardment suffered extensive casualties. Nevertheless, they managed to repair and complete the structure. At noon, an Egyptian brigade attempted to pierce the corridor but was turned back. So were later attacks. Adan's tanks began to rumble over. The situation was now becoming perilous for the Egyptians. An old vice of the Arabs now resurfaced: the unwillingness to report hard truths. Initially, the Second Army reported that only a company or two of the Israelis had crossed. According to Trevor Dupai, had the Egyptians quickly recognized the nature of the Israeli operation, there is little doubt that they had the force on both East and West Banks to smash the Israeli attempt. When belatedly the true extent of the breakthrough became known, General Shazli immediately asked Sadat's permission to withdraw 4 armored brigades with 200 tanks from the Sinai and bring them on the west bank of the canal to counter the Israeli penetration. Sadat, though, vacillated and wasted 36 precious hours before agreeing to this. By then, it was too late. 3 Israeli armored divisions, led by Generals Sharon, Adan, and Megan, had crossed the canal with an intention to encircle both the Second and Third Armies and wreak havoc in their rear. Most of the SAM anti-aircraft shield was also destroyed. Sharon led the attack in the north against the Second Army. He managed to close in on Ismailia, but was defeated in his attempt to encircle the Second Army, and a stalemate developed in this sector of the front. But the situation in the south turned dire for the Egyptians. Adan and Megan's divisions advanced quickly and were about to encircle the Third Army when a ceasefire brokered by the USA and Soviet Union came into effect at 7 p.m. on the 22nd of October. A bit predictably, Israel broke the ceasefire soon and blamed it on the Egyptians. According to Israeli historian Abraham Rabinovich, when Israeli Chief of General Staff David Elazar asked Defense Minister Dayan about resuming the offensive in violation of the ceasefire, the latter readily agreed and told Elazar to just make sure that the army spokesman pointed out that Israel was reacting to Egyptian violations of the ceasefire. The Israelis wanted to cement their victory by encircling the Third Army, and they knew that the USA would stall the Soviet Union while they fought to achieve their goal. Egyptian journalist Mohammed Hakel was spot on when he wrote, "No Arab politician or commander had any excuse for being surprised that immediately the ceasefire came into effect, the Israelis began to break it. This was the traditional Israeli practice." The Israelis weren't disappointed, as their US allies bought valuable time for them by haggling pointlessly over who broke the ceasefire and how it could be reimposed. In the words of Howard Sacker, Kissinger purchased an additional 72 hours for Israel to widen its bridgehead in Egypt. So the Israeli offensive against the Third Army continued, and finally General Megan managed to capture the port of Adabia and encircle the Third Army. By the 24th of October, all links between the Third Army and Cairo had been severed. On this date, another ceasefire was proclaimed after Soviet leader Brezhnev threatened unilateral action against the Israelis if they continued violating the ceasefire. The Russians also insisted that the Israelis return to the ceasefire line of 22nd October, but the Americans responded with quite a lame excuse that no one could be sure of the actual positions occupied by belligerents on the 22nd of October. According to Mohammed Hakel, it was perfectly possible for the Pentagon to compare the situation on the 22nd, when Suez was not encircled and Adabia not occupied, with the situation that had developed by the 24th. Israeli protestations that nobody could tell where the lines of the 22nd had run were not to be taken seriously. Nevertheless, the Israelis not only held on to the areas required for the encirclement of the Third Army, but they also violated this ceasefire in order to capture Suez City on the west bank of the canal, where a major portion of the Third Army's supplies was stored. Had they succeeded, they would undoubtedly have forced the surrender of the Third Army. But Adan's attack on Suez failed, and the Third Army managed to survive. A determined counterattack by the Third Army could have broken the Israeli ring around it, but Sadat had lost all his appetite for war, along with his nerve by now, and he wanted a ceasefire dearly. The Israelis, after their repulse at Suez, also knew that gobbling up the Third Army wouldn't be so easy. According to Trevor Dupai, in retrospect, it is clear that the position of the Third Army was nowhere near as vulnerable as the Israelis, Americans, and Russians believed. Finally, a ceasefire that managed to endure came into effect on the 25th of October, and the Arab-Israeli War of 1973 came to an end. In the next episode of Palestine vs. Israel, we will analyze the war and discuss its aftermath. Stay tuned, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.